Hello, everyone. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. I'm Elizabeth Corey. I'm the founder of beatingtrauma.com, and we're going to talk today about trauma. And specifically, I have in the past, more recently talked about patterns in relationship and how most of the patterns in our relationships can be tracked back to our childhood trauma. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns again, but I'm going to focus more specifically on one type of pattern, which is the pattern of triangulation. It is also a pattern that stems from childhood. So if we are finding ourselves in triangulating situations today, we have likely been in them before. Okay. So I do like to stress that. It's like if we are in a very, very annoying pattern in our adult life, if it is frustrating, angering us, and no matter what we do, we can't seem to get past it. Okay. It came from childhood, to be sure. And it doesn't mean that we specifically and exactly remember where it came from or the specifics of what was happening in our lives in childhood that caused those patterns to become instilled in our unconscious psyche. But something happened to make that. And if we can stay open to that possibility, we oftentimes can get the information necessary to understand where it started. Because if we can process where it started, that means that we can really begin to heal it and move it out for good, which is ultimately what all of us want, right? We're sick and tired of these patterns and we want to move them out for good. So that's why it's so important to allow ourselves to recognize that there is a high likelihood, right, that we have experienced these patterns before. Because, yeah, we're going to have a lot of resistance to that, especially if our controller is telling us a pretty strong story about our childhood right now. And by the story, I do not mean true story. If we're talking fictional versus non-fictional, this would be a fictional story. So there's going to be a really big part in our system that does not want to acknowledge that our traumatic patterns are patterns that drive us crazy every day, started in childhood. So that in and of itself is an obstacle we have to get over. And then, of course, as we continue the journey, we have to figure out what are the specifics of where it started. And that information can become available to you, but it usually won't until we have done some pretty solid work on the ways in which we deny that information. As we begin to heal that stuff, those defenses in our system, then we tend to start getting more information back. So that is a very long-winded description of what we're going to talk about today. Obviously, in and of itself is an important message that needs to be provided. But in general, yes, we're going to talk about triangulation patterns, and with the understanding that they started way, way back when we were children. And we'll kind of talk about it from that angle. Okay. I want to say hi to Nadia. Thank you for being here. I appreciate everyone for joining me today. And by the way, I am flying by the seat of my pants a little bit on this call today. So feel free to jump in and help out when it comes to examples of triangulation. I think I have several, but I didn't get quite as much listed as I wanted to because, well, self-sabotage. Let's talk a little bit about these triangulating patterns. Now, I listed 4 here. Again, I would love your help in breaking these down, and also in coming up with your own that you may also feel were really important triangulating patterns in your own life. So the first one that I have written down to talk about today is, and by the way, I don't even know, I may be assuming that everybody knows what triangulation means. And so maybe starting there with this idea that triangulating means there are 3 people involved in a pattern, basically. You may have been able to guess just by the name. So the first one I have here that I've listed is one person convincing you to join them against another person. Okay. Now, if you grew up in a household where mom and dad were not getting along, okay, you may have particularly experienced this kind of pattern. So this is a triangulation pattern. The key to understanding triangulation patterns in childhood is you don't have any real power or control over the situation. So you aren't voluntarily joining a triangulating pattern when you're a child. You are engaging in them, and it may even seem voluntarily, but really it's just you're trying to survive, right? So survival skills will often be tied very closely to triangulating patterns, okay? So if one person is convincing you to join them against another person, you don't really have a choice. In that moment, you need to join them, right? There's no way you can go, what? No, I don't think I will. That isn't an option for you. And unfortunately, that powerlessness that you feel in those moments where you may really not want to join them against the other person. Maybe you love both parents and you don't want to end up in a situation where you feel like you have to be completely estranged or have a difficult relationship with one parent, but are put in a position probably in this situation where the parent that's asking you to do this may have a bit more power in the family dynamic. Maybe they have more of the money, who knows, but you just are kind of stuck doing this, despite the fact that as a child, you may have no interest in it. So these patterns can show up in our adult lives. The problem isn't the pattern showing up. If we have grown up in a healthy environment and this kind of pattern shows up for us, we will know how to set a boundary or reject the pattern. The problem is that when it has become a part of our childhood and a part of our upbringing, then what ends up happening is this powerlessness. I call it's a flashback. So this powerlessness flashback takes over, and we can get really confused about what our options are. As we may actually think we have none, right? We have to go along with this because this has a tendency to be a powerful authority figure in our lives. We may experience this pattern in adult life with powerful authority figures. Okay. So you may find that your boss encourages you to betray another person on your team or something like that, and you don't feel like you have an option, right? These are the kind of things that end up happening in our adult life that go along with that. Sometimes the genders of the people will actually mirror childhood. Sometimes they won't. But the power dynamics and probably a lot of the survival skills of the other two people will mirror what we experienced in childhood pretty closely. So watching for those triangulating patterns that are showing up in your adult life so that you can go, oh, wait, I'm having a feeling of powerlessness in this situation, so that you can kind of question the veracity of that. You can question whether or not that particular powerlessness is really accurate in this moment, right? So I want to stress that that's really what we're going for here with discovering these patterns. It really does open us up to be able to start shifting out of these so they stop happening. So that's one form of triangulating pattern. The next one I want to talk about is if you experience a betrayal by one person who sides with another. So you become the person who's being sort of ganged up on in this scenario. Now, I want to be clear. We're not usually just going to have one triangulation pattern in our lives. It can actually shift and change almost daily in certain households where there is a ton of interpersonal dysfunction. So one day you may be forced to team up with one parent against another parent, and the next day the two parents are teaming up against you. Totally realistic based on dysfunctional interpersonal relationships in families. So you can experience all of these triangulations that I'm talking about. They can also happen with different people within the family too. Okay. So I want to really stress that because it's true. This one really hits hard when you feel this betrayal where two people have ganged up, and it may be a situation where one person was able to kind of get information from you or maybe kind of push you to let your guard down a little bit, something like that. And then they get that information and they go to this other person, and between the two of them then use it against you. That is a very common way in which triangulation can show up, right? So watching for that in your life, if you find that it seems like whenever somebody kind of gets you to a place where you can be vulnerable, they then get that information and immediately use it against you. And this keeps happening over and over again in your life. And it seems like there's this kind of partnership or group betrayal happening, this triangulation pattern could be going all the way back, right, to childhood where something similar happened to us. So really watching for that kind of thing is important. So the next one I want to talk about, and please do feel free to let me know if there's a triangulation pattern that is specifically strong for you, that's happened for you, that you want me to highlight today, because I would love to do that for you as well. The next one that I have here is that one person loves another person more than you. Okay, now this can be a triangulation with parents, right? Where there's a situation, especially if you're dealing with sexual abuse from a father, it can turn in, and I know this is gonna sound yuck and it may trigger some of you to hear this, but there can be this competitive relationship between mother and daughter for the affections and even the sexual affections of a father. And that's really hard to take in, but I see it all the time. I mean, obviously in my life, this was a very active pattern, but also many clients have experienced this sort of things. It is a really sick pattern, but it is a really active, true pattern for a lot of people. And it can manifest in our adult lives in some unfortunate ways. I know I actually wrote a blog post a while back called The Girl on the Side. I'm pretty sure that's what I called it. The whole idea is that most of the adult romantic relationships I had, I was not the number one priority of that other person. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they were involved in another relationship and I was officially like side chick, but it always meant that there was something that was a higher priority. Because of my background with sexual abuse, I also had a tendency to attract into my space men who had an overly invasive and boundaryless relationship with their mothers. So it didn't necessarily mean that it was that person's in another relationship and then I'm on the side. It could have also meant that that person is just too devoted to another human being to put me first, right? So it's not always about that other romantic relationship, but it's about that other relationship that gets prioritized higher than my relationship with them. So I was in this pattern constantly until I figured out, oh, now I know where that's coming from. And that came from this constant competition between my mother and I, which didn't just apply to my biological father. Then my stepfather came in, same pattern. Basically anybody my mother dated in between my father and my stepfather, it played into, I didn't want anything to do with any of those people and I was still getting dragged into this thing, right? And I was just a kid. But this was this forced pattern that I was put in. So yes, this is a big one. If you find that you are always that side chick in one of the ways that I've described here today, it probably means that that's kind of how you felt in your childhood at home. And that's really hard to hear, especially if maybe you're not at a point where you're really buying into the whole story of what happened to you yet. Then this would be particularly hard. But again, hold open the possibility. Just keep it in mind. And you don't have to have all the information right now. And the last pattern I wanted to mention today is huge, and it doesn't just exist in families. The way I like to think about patterns in general is they're going to exist on 3 different levels. There's the micro level, there's the macro level, and then there's the internal level. Okay. Now, obviously, this is also a bit of a oversimplification because nothing is so easy as it's in one of these 3 categories, but it gives you a sense of the different ways in which patterns can exist. So the individual level means that we're going to see that pattern internally with our parts. Our parts are going to play out those patterns on the inside. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. The second, the micro pattern is usually going to be within the family. So we're going to see this pattern playing out within the family. And then the macro pattern is we're going to see this pattern playing out at very high levels within society as a whole, okay? And so oftentimes patterns are going to be, you're going to be able to see them on all three of those levels. And in this case is probably, for me personally, one of the most obvious examples of where you're going to see this pattern playing out in three different ways in your life. And this pattern is what is affectionately known as the divide and conquer pattern, right? This does not have to be just a triangulation, okay? There can actually be many, many, many people involved in divide and conquer, but I wanted to use it in this triangulation example because oftentimes it is that. The first thing that shows up for me when I think about divide and conquer is my mother dividing my sister and I. Okay, now again, you might have had 5 siblings and you were all experiencing some version of this, right? Some version of being divided. I've heard many interviews, well, not many interviews, but there have been some people who have been involved in trafficking. So these would be pimps I'm talking about specifically, who've been interviewed after they got out of that particular industry for one reason or another. And they have all said that the most important manipulation strategy for a pimp is to make sure the girls all hate each other. Because as soon as they don't, they're going to team up against you, right? And there are 1,000 different ways in which patterns, different ways in which you can manipulate people to not like each other. But it is really super easy when you're dealing with children, because children, unfortunately, especially when we're talking about their parent, children are unfortunately easily manipulated by someone like a parent. Maybe not at first while they're still a bit more committed to the truth, but the whole goal, if the whole goal in your family, excuse me, is to manipulate you, it's gonna happen. Okay? You can't avoid it. There's nobody who has a mind strong enough at 5 years old to stop a parent from manipulating them when that parent wants to. Okay? It is going to happen. So I'm just saying that because hopefully it'll help a little with your own kind of brainwashing that it's your fault. It's not. It's not your fault at all. But divide and conquer is a huge one. And so how it would work in the situation I'm talking about is a parent notices maybe siblings are getting a little too close for comfort. And then they would go in and they would pretend to be one sibling's bestie and they would get information. And then they would pretend to be the other sibling's bestie and they get information. And then they would pit the siblings against each other in some way based on whatever information they gathered. Or they might tell one sibling, oh, the other sibling is just so much smarter than you. And then they tell the other sibling, oh, your sibling is so much prettier than you. And they create this extremely competitive environment between the siblings. And I'm not saying that you can't come out of a home that is highly abusive and that you're always going to come out of that environment hating your siblings. But I will also say I have not met many people who come out of those homes with good relationships with their siblings. And it's not their fault, okay? There is a purposeful behavior. Now, it may be unconsciously purposeful, but there is a desire by the parents in the home to create difficulties between siblings in order for them to preserve their power and control. Okay, this is one of the most common divide and conquer is one of the most common triangulation patterns I personally know about. That said, there are so many, right? There are so many triangulation patterns that we can get connected with. But the interesting thing about this one is we're going to see it in our parts. Our parts will divide and conquer literally in our unconscious. Really, it happens. Our families are doing it, which is what I just described for you. And then we see it all the time at a very macro governmental level. Rich people telling the middle class that it's the lower class that is the problem. And then the middle class or this race is the problem and this race and then pitting races against each other, social classes, while all along, like the real issue is like way up here. All right? It happens all the time. It's been happening forever. There are wars that have happened because of triangulation. I'm not exaggerating. This is a big thing. It's like keep their eye off of the one who's in charge by keeping them at odds with each other. been doing it since the beginning of time, right? Watching that kind of thing play out and learning what's going on there can actually help you in understanding the brainwashing that's happening on all levels of our society, in our families, and then even internally. I kid you not, the controller internally will pit our parts up against each other. We have to kind of catch that stuff before it gets out of hand, because they'll do it. Anything they can do to distract so they can stay in charge, they will do it. So watch for all of these kind of patterns. Watch for them in all areas of life, but especially if you have a pattern where you were like, oh, why does this keep happening to me again and again and again? I'm so tired of this. Why is it everybody I meet treats me the same way? You want to go back to the beginning, right? Back to the beginning. This interpersonal pattern existed somewhere in your childhood in some way. Okay. And I know we use a lot of examples today that involve parents. It doesn't have to be parents, but I will say that our primary patterns that rule our lives will often have something to do with at least a parent. But you can have many triangulation patterns that involve grandparents, that involve aunts, uncles, cousins, but also people who are just extremely close to the family, who are in the family a lot. They can also be involved in these patterns. But don't take your eye off of good old mom and dad, because a lot of the times they're going to be driving the patterns that make us the craziest now. The frustration. Can you hear the frustration? I hate these patterns. But that's where it's coming from. Thank you all so much for being here and listening to what I have to say on this topic, and I'll talk to you next week.